Thank you for joining today. So, today we're talking about the 80-10-10 diet and if it can boost mood, what the actual science and data has to say about it. And if you're interested in nutritional psychiatry like I am, now there's a new thing called metabolic psychiatry, which is really the land that I live in, then you'll be really interested in this webinar where we're basically talking about mental health and nutrition. So we know that depression is a huge issue in the country right now in America. 18% of the American population is suffering from depression. That's about almost 48 million people. That's according to Gallup. Students are suffering, celebrities and professional athletes are suffering from it. According to the National Alliance on Mental Health, 23% of adults 18 years or older are diagnosed with depression each year, which translates to about 60 million people. And when it comes to women specifically, those numbers tend to run a little higher, with 24% of women in the United States currently living with depression, and over one third of women, which is about 36%, report having been diagnosed with depression in their lifetime. And this is compared to a little over 20% of men. But we need to also add the caveat here that this is diagnosed depression, right? There's so many people who are not going to a professional to get a diagnosis. So I'm pretty sure the numbers are a lot higher than this. And then to add to the mix, we have something called high functioning depression, which basically means individuals, they have depression, they have the symptoms of depression, but they're able to still go about their life and do their business. They're able to accomplish goals, go to work, do the bare minimum they need to do, but they have that low mood, that emotional exhaustion, and all of the symptomology of depression, basically. So, with that being said, we know that there's an issue, and the numbers are most likely a lot higher than even what we can see. What can nutrition do to help? So, with the 80-10-10 diet, this is basically a macro plan that was popularized by Dr. Doug Graham, and he has a book of the exact same name called 80-10-10, which I highly recommend that you get. It was picked up by the raw food community. Like it's specifically, I think, written for the raw food community. And so primarily, those are the folks that are really talking about it and doing it. However, you don't have to be 100% raw to follow an 80-10-10 plan. But basically, what it means is you're getting 80% of your calories from carbohydrates, which all plant foods are carbs, right? So if you're living in the plant kingdom, it just means really for this, because 10% is coming from protein and 10% coming from fat, and most specifically that fat. To keep fat to 10% or lower, you're getting, and to get enough calories, you're doing that 80% is mostly coming from fruit, right? Those calories from carbs, they're mostly coming from fruit because fruit have protein and fat. And you're also eating vegetables, very little nuts and seeds, because that will tend to drive up that fat percentage. And some people thrive on this. I'm one of those people who thrive on 80-10-10 because in my family, which I realize I think is more of a genetic component, high fat like physically causes us pain and can cause all sorts of other issues as well. But at the bare bones, we're having physical pain, getting higher levels of fat, especially when it's coming from saturated fat. Okay, so now we have an understanding of what 80-10-10 is. How does it affect mental health? According to the literature, if you can see this, I'm trying to move my video out the way. But the literature supports 80-10-10 because it says in the research that the higher fruit and vegetable consumption, the lower the risk of depression by 9 to 15%. Now, the higher processed food and junk food, basically the standard American diet, the higher your risk of depression by 15 to 33%. And how do we know that? There's been meta-analysis, right, of at least 10 studies showing this that there's a higher veggie intake is associated with a 9% lower odds of incident of depression. Higher fruit intake, there is a 15% lower odd incident of depression. And we see in the science high inflammatory diet associated with 33% increase in depression. Higher standard American diet or Western diet, you get a 15% increase in incident of depression. They even studied twins. So if people want to say, oh, there has to be a genetic component to this, there's always going to be a genetic component, right? However, even looking at twins, you still see the same trends, which just shows that fruits and vegetables really make the difference, right? You want to consume as much fruits and vegetables as possible to lower your depression risk. Now, you may have noticed on this nice little infographic that it says in the research that potatoes, of course, they count as a vegetable because technically they are a vegetable. They can negate the protective association with depression. So you may be asking, why is that? Most of Americans and most people eating a Western diet, when they're consuming potatoes, they're consuming it in the form of French fries, right? And anytime we're eating food, we are creating advanced glycation end products, which are compounds basically that age the cells of the body, right? Anytime we eat, but we can't not eat, right? However, when you're eating raw fruits and vegetables, you're in the double digits on the ages. When you're eating processed food, fried food, meat, dairy, eggs, you're in the triple digits with the ages, right? So you are accumulating a lot more ages. And when you accumulate them in the tissues, it increases inflammation and oxidative stress, which is one of the risk factors for cognitive decline and mental health decline. It damages blood vessels, kidneys, nerves, and the brain, right? And you need healthy blood flow in order to have a healthy brain because that is how the brain is getting nutrients. And it accelerates complications in diabetes and metabolic disease. When you have metabolic disease, when you have insulin resistance, which is the mechanism behind diabetes, you have an unhealthy brain because these things hormonally are affecting the function, the actual functioning of the brain. And so this is why you see in the literature that potatoes is showing this negative effect. It's because of how we are consuming them. Now, you may be asking yourself, why is fruit more protective than vegetables? Because we just looked at the data. It said fruit has 15% reduction. The more you're consuming fruit, you have a 15% reduction in depression compared to a 9% reduction with vegetables, right? Isn't sugar bad for the brain, right? So many folks are afraid of fruit. And literally, some people, their doctors are telling them. I heard a woman tell me recently that she liked to have smoothies at home, even though I see her eating out all the time and purchasing fast food all the time, like breakfast, lunch, and dinner, because she spends a lot of time at work. She said that the doctor told her to lay off of the smoothies because her blood sugar is getting a little high. But he didn't mention anything about the fact that she's eating Chick-fil-A all the time, which to me is malpractice, right? That's not informed consent. That's not doing no harm. And so you have people out here who are not being educated when they talk to a doctor in a white coat about how to actually be healthy. So they don't have to be dependent on pharmaceutical drugs. So you have folks afraid of sugar. Oh my gosh, I can't have fruit because this is gonna be a problem. Let's talk about it, okay? Obviously, there's a difference. There's a difference in nutrient bioavailability when we look at fruits and vegetables and processed food, refined sugar, difference in preparation methods, and the specific biological interactions of fruit-based sugars versus added sugars. So when we talk about raw versus cooked, so fruits are typically consumed raw, regardless of folks' diet, because when they're looking at the literature, they're not necessarily looking at vegans or raw vegans. Good luck finding literature that's specifically studying raw vegans. That's what we need more of, actually. Because in my view, they have the cleanest diet. So what can be possible? We need more research on that, I feel like, to really change the system. But generally, for the masses, folks are consuming fruits raw. And when you cook food, it changes the bioavailability, especially when we talk about heat sensitive nutrients, vitamins, enzymes. You kill these things that are heat sensitive. So the all of the antioxidants and nutrients that you would have in a raw food, you lose when you cook it. And so clearly what we're seeing here, since fruits have such an outsized impact on mental health, on depression specifically, which is what we're talking about today, then it's because of these nutrients. Whereas the vegetables, they're usually cooked, right? So it's just a matter of these heat sensitive, bioavailable vitamins, antioxidants, micronutrients that are being kept intact that is making the difference for mental health. Now, in regards to the sugar paradox, it's important to know, and this is straight from the literature, like at the end of this webinar, you'll see a slide that has all my references on it. So you see where I'm gathering all this information, especially since it's not at the bottom of the slide. All of that research is at the end for you to dive into and really tweeze out and spend time in. But high glycemic fruits like pineapple, for example, they don't carry the same risk as processed sugary foods. Why is that? The processing, right? They did a study on older adults and found that even fruits with high glycemic index were associated with a reduced odds of depressive symptoms. And in the neuroscience community, right, they tend to not really want to recommend high glycemic fruits so much because it does affect the functioning of the prefrontal cortex. And I personally have experienced this where I have a high glycemic fruit and I'm either feeling more anxious or less focused. So I've personally experienced what the neuroscientists are saying in regards to high glycemic fruits. At the same time, it's clearly of no comparison to refined sugar from eating like a cookie or a candy with all these other chemicals and stuff. And it's no comparison. High glycemic fruits are less inflammatory than processed sugary fruits. They're actually not inflammatory at all. Pineapple is a great example because pineapple has anti-inflammatory compounds, great for the digestive system, and it is high glycemic. It's very healing for the body and it's high glycemic. So it can't even really be compared to refined sugar and junk foods and processed foods. It's because of the processing that these things are inflammatory to the body, right? It's not so much sugar. Sugar has gotten a bad rap, right? If you have sugar wrapped in fiber and nutrients and vitamins and enzymes, this is helpful for the body. And we see based on the literature, it is helping to lower the risk of depression. But when you strip all the nutrients away from that sugar and you add all these chemicals, now it is causing inflammation, right? So sugar is not necessarily sugar. Then there's the biological mechanism of fruit. Fruit, like bananas, they're rich in tryptophan, which is a precursor to serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitter is just a big word for basically messages that are being sent to the brain. And this serotonin is responsible for mood regulation. Citrus fruits and berries, right? They've been linked to stability in mental health because of their high flavonoid and folate content. And folate plays a critical role in producing neurotransmitters like dopamine and epinephrine. Then, why are we seeing this difference comparing fruit consumption to vegetable consumption? Another reason is that's hypothesized is that vegetables might not be protective in some studies because they're just not consumed in high enough quantities to produce an effect. And this honestly makes a lot of sense to me because regardless of diet, and I'm pretty sure if you look at your own family, your own community, wherever you're eating out with folks and watch people's eating patterns, everybody, just about everybody I know loves fruit, but not everyone is feeling vegetables like that, right? This needs to be into the mix. But a recent Australian research that came out said that reduced intake of vegetables, like about 3 servings versus 5 servings, still offer benefits for those experiencing depression. So this is not a hit piece on vegetables. We need vegetables. We love vegetables, right? But fruits are showing an outsized impact. And so when we're thinking about 80-10-10 and its emphasis on fruit, which is really mostly, especially in the raw food community, to get enough calories to have enough energy for the body to do what it needs to do, it's showing a huge benefit for mental health. You may be asking, as your next question, logically, is 10% fat too low for brain health? Because I've heard people say the brain is made up of fat, so we need to be eating high fat. I don't know. You could tell me in the chat if you've heard this from people before. We need to eat fat because the brain is made of fat, right? According to the research, there are no associations between total fat intake and the incidence of depression in studies that have been done on middle-aged to older adults. And what's most important is really the quality of fat, right? So we don't really care about how much fat, right? The 10% in terms of mental health doesn't really much matter, but the quality of the fat matters. And specifically, we're looking for omega-3 fatty acids. We in the standard American diet and the Western diet consume a lot of omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid because of all the processed food, all of the restaurant food, all the junk food that we are consuming. Then the European Society of Cardiology recommended, they put out guidelines that recommends that saturated fat in particular should not exceed 10% of total daily energy intake. And again, I could just personally say that this makes sense, just what I see in my family, because I wasn't the first one to cut out meat in my family, actually. In my like immediate, not immediate, not the nuclear family, but my immediate circle of family. I wasn't the first one. And it was specifically because of this, because of physical pain and that was coming from saturated fat being too high. So, since we're talking about fat, let's dive into fat a little bit because this is where I feel like things could probably get a little bit complicated. So I kind of want to explain saturated versus unsaturated, the and within unsaturated, mono versus poly and trans. Okay. So saturated fat, that's your meat, your dairy, your eggs. Eggs actually have saturated unsaturated fat and naturally has trans fat as well. I bet a lot of people don't know because trans fat was banned in the American food supply, but it's naturally found in low levels in meat and dairy and also eggs. It also can be found in partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, which is why I highly recommend staying away from these cheap vegetable oils, right? We want to stick to EVU, organic extra virgin olive oil. Saturated fat, we talked about meat, dairy, eggs, but also palm oil, which in the vegan community, folks are getting a lot of in the processed food. Because when you look at plantain chips, when you look at lots of other chips out there, I've seen bagels, I've seen breads, you really have to check ingredients because they seem to be pushing palm oil into everything. And this is really destructive for our cardiovascular system. And like I said, you want a healthy, clean cardiovascular system to make sure your brain is getting the best support possible. Monounsaturated fat, this is the fat that helps to protect your heart, right? With maintaining levels of good HDL and reducing levels of LDL. That's what we want low, right? The LDL we want low and the HDL we want high. And so where do you get monounsaturated fat? That's the olive oil, rapeseed oil, that is canola oil, spreads made with these oils. So like in the vegan community, that tends to be like the fake mayonnaise, the fake butter, all these fake stuff, right? You have to check the ingredients. And this is why if you're feeling inflammation or if you're dealing with a diabetes diagnosis and you're trying to get your A1C down and it's not coming down, look at what you're eating. Look at the bagels, the breads, the chips, a lot of this stuff, the vegan ice cream, right? There's oils in these things. And so you want to just be careful about that. Avocados, you get the monounsaturated and some nuts like almonds, Brazil nuts, peanuts, things like that. Polyunsaturated, This is where you get the omega 3s and omega 6. And honestly, for us, if we're trying to be healthy, you don't really have to focus in on omega 6 because you will get omega 6. We don't have a hard time getting omega 6. What we're having a difficult time doing without intentionality is getting omega 3s, and that you get from, of course, you could get from fish if you also want the toxicity that comes with fish. The highest source of DDT consumption, which is a banned carcinogenic chemical, is through fish. Also, in fish, you have PFAS chemicals. These are the forever chemicals, and plastics, microplastics, both of which are endocrine disruptors. And once your hormones go out of balance, which is what that means, this is impacting your brain and how you think, feel, and behave, right? The brain is the organ of your personality. In order for the brain to be healthy and be well, for you to be you, you want to get your omega 3s from walnuts, flax seeds, chia seeds, hemp seeds, leafy greens, avocado, right? These are healthy sources of omega 3 fats. You may be asking, can I be a junk food vegan and still see benefits? And maybe you're not asking because you heard what I said before. It just doesn't work. This is the problem with the data when they look at plant-based folks, right? They actually did a study on plant-based diets in college students, and they found no significant link between eating more plants and improvements in mental health. How could that be? That's because they're eating lots of junk food. They're eating fried tofu, right? Underscore fried. Vegan desserts with the oils and the refined sugar. They're missing the nutrients that actually make the brain healthy, right? So, based on everything we just said prior, really, why are fruits doing such heavy lifting? In this case study, looking at depression and nutrition and the effect on the brain, and it's because of the nutrients from keeping it raw and all those nutrients intact, we're getting this outsized benefit, right? And when your diet is so full of junk food and oil and refined sugar, stripped of any nutritional value, you're not going to get that. And the studies say point blank period, right? Junk food consumption strongly linked to higher levels actually of depression and anxiety. It's basically just like the Western diet. So plant-based or not, it doesn't matter. It's the quality of the food that you're consuming. Now, what would be the complete opposite of 80-10-10? The ketogenic diet, which apparently is a huge trend right now. You have so many vegan restaurants closing down, and I've heard people say, I think this is because of the keto trend. With 80-10-10, you're doing 80% carbs and 10% fat. With keto, you go up to 75% fat and you're keeping carbs 10% or less. So it's like the complete opposite. And proteins in the middle with 20 to 25%. So, what does the data have to say about keto? Now, this is such a huge topic. I have a few blogs, but there's one blog in particular where I do a real deep dive on this in particular, and I have a QR code. So, if you want to take a screenshot or just scan that QR code, that will take you to the blog. But the short version is that basically, in the short term, people are saying they're getting benefits from keto, and the literature just it shows that, right? In a short term, people seem to get better. However, in the long term is where people are struggling, right? First of all, people have a hard time staying on keto beyond 12 months. So it's not a sustainable diet. And why is that? It's not like you're just eating whatever you want. The whole point of keto is you need to stay in ketosis in order to have the benefits, right? Now, as an 80-10-10er, I could tell you, you can still get in ketosis without loading up on all this saturated fat through other mechanisms like intermittent fasting or longer states of fasting. These folks here, though, you actually have to measure this. It's hard to stay in it and to maintain that. And so people fall off typically at the 12-month mark. And cholesterol is just going crazy, right? It's raising LDL cholesterol because they're eating so much fat. I don't really have too much studies on vegan keto. So this is basically what I'm saying is about the just the regular keto that is animal-based, right? I think it would be great if we had more like plant-based or vegan keto studies out there to see what they have to say. But I do know from my work, just looking at the brain and being Amen trained, brain health licensed trainer, Amen University trained, that different people thrive on different macros. So I could say personally, I thrive on 80-10-10. There are folks that have the brain type that thrive higher fat, some folks higher protein. And I think where you're getting your nutrient source from matters a lot, right? It matters a lot. And this is basically the literature is just backing that up and supporting that. It's the quality and the source, right? Another important thing, I don't know if you noticed this on the infographic, but the keto diet, apparently folks on the keto diet are losing fat-free mass, right? And this is important to know. So people come to me and they want to lose weight. And I say, I need you to get a bioimpedance scale because I need to see what actually is happening to your body, the body composition, right? Because what makes up your weight, you have fat, of course, but you also have organs, you have bones, you have water, you have muscle, right? You have all these other things going on. We definitely don't want to lose that other stuff. The water we don't really have control over, and you definitely don't want to dehydrate the body because that's dangerous for the brain. But we want to focus in on the fat. In order to do that, I need to see exactly what's going on in terms of the body composition. Now, when we look at the ketogenic diet, people say they losing weight, right, in the short term. But guess what happens in the long term? They're losing fat-free mass. And even when they, in the studies, when they try to account for this by having folks do resistance training, even the addition of the resistance training apparently is not ameliorating this loss. So, what does that mean? They are losing muscle mass, they are losing bone mass. Why? They're eating all this fat and they're losing muscle and bone. This is scary, especially I know with the clientele, I work with women 50 plus who have chronic disease. Sometimes they have layers and layers of issues going on. And then when you are a woman that's aging, we want to preserve muscle and preserve bone so we're not falling over because when you get older, the worst thing that could happen is a bad fall, right? Frailty. They say, and I've been sharing in my program, my brain health breakthrough coaching program, the latest studies that have come out on how they're linking frailty to dementia. Once you fall down and you end up in the hospital, that you are now susceptible to all sorts of infections and things that could happen in the hospital. Typically, depending on the age, these folks don't come out. Things get progressively worse just from a fall. So we want to maintain the muscle mass. If anything, we want to maintain and build muscle mass. We want to keep that. We want to preserve bone mass, right? We don't want to go in the opposite direction as much as we can, as much as we physically can. And typically, I recommend resistance training to do that, especially since we're already eating nutrient dense. But for the folks that are doing keto, with resistance training, they're losing this mass. And the only way I can explain this is because their diet is so inflammatory. It's literally leaching nutrients from the bones. And so they're losing this mass. Now, I can't just have this conversation on depression and mood without talking about issues that are beyond the control of our plates, right? We do want to acknowledge the fact that food insecurity is a huge barrier. And right now, there's a lot of people that don't have access to nutrient dense foods. And so they are more likely to deal with the nutrient poor diet, right? To eat a lot of junk food and then be at risk for depression. Like here, I say depression, and based on the research that I looked through, there was more than the group dealing with depression was more than twice as likely in food insecure individuals. And that makes sense because obviously it's a stressor to be food insecure, which could be driving the depression. And on the other hand, because you're food insecure, you're eating poor food, and that could be driving the depression. So it's coming at them from both ends. Stress can cause depression as well, right? Lack of social support, lack of sleep, body dissatisfaction or dysmorphia, body dysmorphia. And there's some gender differences. So, specifically, the literature is showing that diet quality predicts depression more in men. And when it comes to women, sugar intake in particular was strongly tied more to anxiety. But we know that both genders obviously could benefit from higher nutrient density, right? But it's not necessarily going to be a one size fits all. So we need to look at this, yes, from the individual perspective. There are things that we can do to protect our brain from going to the dark place, right? To get into that low mood, and that's eating as many fruits as possible. And I know it's really rough right now in the wintertime for a lot of folks, depending on where you live, access to that is very difficult. But we have frozen fruits if you can get it, and just doing the best you can. This stuff actually points to some things that are non-food related that we could be doing to preserve our mental health. Like, where in our life can we look at right now to alleviate some stress? Where can we lean in for social support? Right? Who can we ask for help? If you are making dinner for New Year's, maybe don't do it alone. Maybe ask your family member to chip in and to support you and do it as a family. And it could be a fun communal experience. Making sure you get enough sleep, like at least 7 hours consecutively, right? So you could have time to fall into the different stages of sleep that are restorative, like REM, for example. This helps the brain and it helps with our mood. It helps to stave off depression. So here's the prescription for the night. Should you try the 80-10-10 diet for depression? I would love to hear from you if you want to type in the chat how you're feeling about it, like what questions you have about it. But ultimately, if you wanted to try it, right, since it seems like a great direction. When we think about mental health, the first step would be to crowd out the bad with the good, right? So we want to crowd out the junk food by just filling up more on fruits, on raw vegetables, right? On fiber rich, nutrient dense protein. And naturally, as we're eating more fiber, more nutrient dense foods, there's less food for the junk. Now, junk food, of course, has very little fiber, so it's easy to fill up on those things. So, being intentional about not buying them, not having sugar around, or ultra processed foods around that could be tempting, and making sure you stay full and you have your snacks so temptation is not pulling you so much. And you want to focus on the fat for the brain health, right? So, specifically, omega-3 fats. That's what we talked about before: chia, flax, hemp, leafy greens, avocados, right? We want to get those. And if you are in a state, or your gut's in a state where eating these foods, you don't feel good, like you have some food intolerances or something like that, there are omega-3 algae-based supplements that you can take clean, right? Instead of using fish oil, right? Because fish oil has just as much toxicity as eating fish. And then four, we want to nourish our nervous system. So that means rest, community, nature, taking walks outside if you can. And if you can't because the weather doesn't allow, then bring nature inside. Maybe buy some flowers, buy some plants, start gardening. Maybe you may want to get a tower garden like I have, where you're growing produce inside. Therapy is also very effective, and exercise. And we know that exercise is just as effective for depression as pharmaceutical drugs, and without the side effects. And then number five, I always recommend to my clients keeping a journal so you could track how you feel, track what you're eating, track your mood. And so you have a running history of what you've been doing and how you've been feeling. So anytime that you feel like you're off, you can actually look back at that running history and make some common sense adjustments. And these are the references. If you want to take a screenshot, you can dive in. Everything I've mentioned here is all evidence-based. And I would love to hear from you if you have any questions about anything that I've discussed or any particular questions on the topic. No questions? I answered all of them. I tried to think of what would be the logical question that come up. So maybe I just did such an excellent job of answering all the questions. So you have no questions for me. I guess, and also I have another question for you. Are you already eating 80-10-10, or what inspired you to show up here today? All right, so with that, I will close out. Hopefully, you have an amazing new year and have a blessed night. Thank you for joining me.